So when I was a kid, we went to this like very traditional church, the kind that has like Sunday school, and then you go to the main service worshiping. So some of you guys are like, man, I only have to put up with this for an hour. Imagine having to do Sunday school as well, right? I know some of you maybe experienced that, maybe you haven't. I did not like it for a long time as a kid, okay? I was the kid that my parents had to drag me to church, and I would always kick and scream and complain for a long time because I didn't want to go. And I remember one time in particular where I was like, man, I'm going to get out of this. And maybe for some of you, that was your mentality you tried before coming in this morning and you still were dragged here. And if so, I apologize for you. But I'm glad you're here. But I can empathize because there was one Sunday I remember as a kid, and I was like, I'm going to pretend like I'm sick. I know some of you are like, I've tried to play sick to get out of school. I've done that. Some of you, maybe teachers, are already planning on doing that tomorrow as well, okay? No judgment here on that. But I tried one time to get out of going to church by playing sick. I only tried it one time, and it failed miserably, okay? Because my mom, she was smarter than me. And she saw through my lies and all, I thought I was clever. And so, man, I tried to give it my best performance, like I think I even dabbed a little water in my face to make it look like I was sweating. And I was like, Mom, my stomach is hurting. I can't go to church today. Can I just stay home? In reality, I just want to stay home and play video games all day. But my mom, she saw through this. She's like, nope, we're going. You're still going to get dressed up. And we had to dress up in this uncomfortable outfits. I couldn't go in jeans and a t-shirt. And we still had to do this. And she dragged us to church. And then I had to sit through Sunday school. But here's the thing. All throughout Sunday school, I was like, okay, she won that battle, but the war is not over, right? I'm going to make it so we did not have to go to the main worship portion because I was sitting there thinking, I don't want to listen to some old guy talk, and I don't understand what this is all about. So we went in there, and as soon as we met together, me and my mom met back up with each other in the foyer, I just laid it on thick. Like I started moaning, I started complaining, I think I fell on the ground, just like flailing all over the place. For all of you parents who maybe feel like, okay, I was embarrassed today by my kid at church, you have nothing compared to the performance I put on for my mom, all right? I think it was Oscar worthy. I was like, I'm so proud of this. Other people were coming up and like, oh, sweetie, are you all right? And my mom, she just standing back there. I could tell she's just fuming, right? She is so mad. She's getting red in the face, and I'm sitting there, like, as I'm with her, I'm like, I got her. She will cave in because she doesn't want to get embarrassed anymore, and I was wrong. Because my mom, she gave me a choice. She's like, okay, here's your two choices. You can either sit next to me in the pew and be quiet and be respectful, otherwise you're going to pay for it later on when you go home, right? And some of you parents, you understand what I'm talking about right there. Or she said, you can spend the entire time in the men's bathroom and I'll come get you after the service. And I chose the men's bathroom because I was like, man, if I'm back there, she'll start to feel guilty. She'll start to worry about me. She'll come back and be like, halfway through the service, I'm so sorry. Maybe you really are sick. Let's come. Let's leave. And that never happened, right? So I spent this entire service in this bathroom at this church. And let me tell you, it was the most boring experience of my life. Because you're sitting there quietly for like 2 hours in a bathroom, twiddling your thumbs, counting ceiling tiles. And I swear, this preacher, that was the longest sermon he has ever given in his life, was that Sunday. Because I'm sitting there thinking, we are never getting out of here. It took so long that I started to think the rapture had happened and Jesus forgot about me because I was in the bathroom and he never checked in there, right? I thought we were never going to leave. But looking back, I am so grateful for that day happening. For one thing, I decided, it's worth probably putting up through the pastor's sermon than sitting in the bathroom waiting all the time. I was like, there are worse things in the world right now than hearing a sermon. But I also was very appreciative because at that moment, as a young kid, I started to ask questions that I never asked before about worship, of why does this matter? And why are we gathering together? And what is this supposed to accomplish? Maybe some of you have had the same thoughts. Maybe some of you, you've just grown up in church your entire life. You've never even had those thoughts. But I guarantee you know who has? Are the people right now who aren't here. You see, while there are a lot of churches in town, only a very small percentage of the population actually goes to church. Most people are doing other things. They're in other places that they would rather be. And because when they drive by the church right now, here's what they're thinking. And I'm going to put it so blunt. We're going to put it up on the screen so it's a little jarring. Here's what they're thinking. That worship doesn't mean anything. And it does nothing. And maybe some of you are like, man, I'm there, right? Like I'm here because I'm here for someone else. But that's kind of what I think too. And if that's your case, I'm not judging you. I'm actually really glad you're here. Because we are in this series talking about worship. And we see that it's more than just singing songs. When you actually look at what Jesus has to say about worship, you see that it's about a life where every heartbeat of your life is about proclaiming, all hail the King. And so we've been looking at this short series for 3 weeks now, looking at what Jesus has to say. And this is why we are doing this, because if Jesus, it matters to him worship, it should matter to us. And here's why. Because if the dude can predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off, I don't care what you believe. I want what matters to him to matter to me, right? Like that's the kind of life I want to live. And so for Jesus, he thought worship mattered. And he thought it did something. But when he talked about worship in his day, it was like a wrecking ball. You see, the way that people viewed worship in his day was that you had to show up perfect. You had to do certain things. You had to follow certain steps. You had to obey certain laws and certain rituals, all so that you would seem perfect. So it looked like you would have no problem in your life. Because in that mindset, nothing mattered more than your perception of your relationship with God. It didn't matter the people around you. It didn't matter what was going on in the world around you. All that mattered was between you and God. And Jesus came in, and he came in like a wrecking ball, and he shattered this belief. And so we've been looking at that because Jesus had something to say about how we come in preparing for worship. He said something about what it's like when we are together. And today we're going to look at what he said about what this should accomplish throughout the rest of our time separated from each other. Now, if you have not been a part of this series at all, I've never said this, but I really encourage you to go back and watch those previous messages because they will change how we come in here into this place. Because when you look at what Jesus has to say about worship, the first one is when we prepare for our worship, we got to make sure that we're not treating each other like jerks. That we're not being cruel and mean and treating each other wrong because we recognize that God loves everybody. God loves the world. So what does it look like when his people who say that we love him turn around and show others hate? It doesn't really work out that way, right? And so if we're going to prepare for our time together, then first off, we got to make sure that the way we're treating one another prior is a way that looks like Jesus. Last week, we looked at what happens when we're together. And it was the fact that when we are together, man, God made us to be sacred people. And that does something for each other, meaning that God has equipped us to shower one another with grace and mercy and inspire one another, encourage one another, to show love to one another when we're together, that something is always happening when you're face to face with another Jesus follower. And today we're going to look at what happens when we separate. What difference should our time together have on our time apart? Now, for this conversation, we're actually looking at a guy named James and the wisdom he has to share. Now, here's a cool thing about James. Historians believe that he was related to Jesus in some way. Some people say that he was a brother. Some people say that he was a cousin. Doesn't matter. Here's a guy who was related to Jesus. Now, here's what's impressive. When you look at the Gospels and you look at history, James did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. He opposed when Jesus was going around saying, the kingdom has come, it's happening with me. James opposed that. He tried to stop Jesus. In fact, he's like, we've got to stop this message because you're a lunatic. I mean, think about it. What would it take for your brother or cousin to convince you that they were king of the universe? Some of you are like, you don't know my cousin or brother. They already think that they're king of the universe. I'm not asking that. I'm saying, what would it take to convince you that they actually are? What it took for James was he saw his brother die on a cross, and he saw his resurrection. And that changed everything for James. He's like, man, this guy who I was opposing, man, he is the real deal. And so he becomes a Jesus follower. And about 10 years after the resurrection of Jesus, he's one of the leaders of the church, shaping history by the things he's saying about what it means to follow Jesus. And he writes a letter called the Letter of James. Now, if you feel good about yourself, If you're having a good day, if you're like, man, I feel nice and pleasant, I'm a good person, don't read the book of James. All right, just telling you, it's going to rain on your parade. All right, the book of James is really mean, but it's good mean, right? If there is such a thing. It's about encouraging us about what it actually looks like to follow Jesus. So he brings out some harsh truths. We're going to look at one single sentence of what he has to say about what our worship should be accomplishing in us when we are no longer together. Here it is. It's in James chapter 1, verse 27. Here's what he says. He starts off and he says, religion. Now, when we look at religion, we're also talking about what it means to truly worship, okay? So don't be confused by that. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. Now, if you were a Jew, your whole life was about living a worship, a religion that was pure and undefiled. You wanted to please God. That was what your life was all about. That's all that you cared about. Now, if you were a Jew, you're like, I already know the answer to this, right? I need to obey these laws. I need to do these things. I need to go and do these certain activities that God wants me to do. That's if you were a Jew. And maybe some of you feel like you already know the answer to this before you read what James has to say. Maybe you're like, I already know what it's like to please God. I need to show up to church. I need to do certain things. I need to make sure I obey certain laws. I need to be a nice person, and I need to not sleep around. That's what I was told growing up, what it looks like to please God. Here's what James actually says. Okay, it's shocking. Going back, he says this. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. Religion that pleases God. Religion that actually does something, that means something is this. To visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Now, it's vital that we understand that what James proposed, nobody expected, right? But he is suggesting that our worship with God has an impact upon those around us when we leave. Let's look at that by seeing who were the widows and orphans. Why is he bringing them up? Because this society back then, the first century world, was a strong patriarchal society, which basically means it ran like this. The man went to work, and the wife stayed home and took care of the house and the children. So if you were a widow and orphan, you lost your financial support. You had no one to take care of you. You were looked down upon in that society. There was no social services. There were no help in that community. You were just the most helpless people in town. And so James is saying this, if you really want to have a worship that means something, that pleases God, that actually does something good, then look for the people who are the most hurting and in need of help around you and do something. See, James understood this concept, that if we worship a God we say has met us in our deepest need, but we lack care for the needs of others, then our worship isn't real. That should scare probably some of us, right? Now, this was something entirely new because the original way of thinking was, man, if this is all about me and God and I've got to look perfect, I've got to do better than those around me. But what James is saying is that we cannot excuse the fact that there are people around us who are in need of hurt or help, who are hurting. Where did James get this crazy idea from? He got it from his brother, Jesus. You see, the night before Jesus died, he gathered together with his followers, and he gives them instructions on how this is going to continue without him, because he knows he's about to die. They don't fully understand that yet, but he's trying to give them instructions like, this is what it's going to look like going on. And he gave them the most central, most important ethic for us as Jesus followers, the most important thing that we need to know about what does it look like to follow Jesus. He tells them this in John chapter 13. John was an eyewitness of this, and he wrote it down because it's so important. He wanted people to know it. And he said this, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. All right, now what does love look like? Is it a feeling? Is it something we fall in and out of? Is it something that, man, we choose to do it, but I can love you but not love you? What does love look like? Now, our world loves to give definitions of love. And most of them, if you think about them hard enough, most of them are kind of shallow or self-centered or self-destructive. When Jesus told his followers to love, he gave them what it looked like to love. He said this, continuing on in that same sentence. He says, to love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. That changes the game, right? Like there's no excuse. So you know how Jesus loved you. And now he's saying go and love others in the exact same way. And here's why he says this is so important. Because the next verse says this, by this all people, meaning your neighbor, your coworker, that person who just drives you nuts, that family member that you really don't want to see at family gatherings, right? He says, by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Notice he didn't say, people are going to know that you're a Jesus follower because you came to church or because you know a lot of Bible verses and Bible facts. Not that those things aren't important. But he says the real proof is in the pudding. It's in how we treat one another. Now, when he said this, when he says to go and love just as he has loved us, now we think of it in terms of the crucifixion because we read that into it. We know what love really looked like. It was taken across. But the disciples, man, they're not there yet. They haven't witnessed the crucifixion. They haven't witnessed God's love displayed on the cross. So when they thought of love, they thought of something very different. They thought of what happened right before Jesus gave them this command. And what happened was Jesus, their Messiah, their King, the guy they've been following around for years, the guy they thought was going to overthrow Rome, the guy they thought was the most important guy in history, they watched as he got on his knees and washed their feet. He humiliated himself. He served them. Dirty fishermen who he knew, he even said, you're about to betray me, so let me get down and wash your feet. And then right after he did that, he said this. Right before he told them to love just as he loved them, he gave them this command. He says, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Jesus and James are both getting at the same thing. That if we actually want this time to mean anything, it requires what happens next. You see, we can have a fantastic worship service. Like last week, we had a fantastic time together. But it meant nothing unless Monday morning happened and we did something with it. This is what James and John are getting at. That if our worship has no care for the suffering one sitting next to you, then it means nothing to the sovereign one over us. If we have no care for the person next to us who might need our help, and we can help them, but we'd rather turn a blind eye, how does that look when we then follow up and say, I'm a Jesus follower, and we recognize that this is how Jesus treated us, but we're not willing to treat each other in the same way? We have to be willing to have our eyes open to see those around us who need us, who can benefit from us stepping into that space. As we recognize what Jesus has done for us, we turn around and do it to others. As a church, we try to do it in a number of different ways. Look at SHP, a ministry that came out of this church, where we looked at this community and said, it's not right for kids to be sleeping on the floors. Let's do something about it. So we've built so many beds, we've delivered them. Why? Because we look at a community and say, this is not right for the church to say, man, we love and we're all about the message of Jesus, but we're not willing to actually be the hands and feet of Jesus. It doesn't work that way, right? Unless we're willing to do that. And here's where it's important when we think about this. This is not I have to do it. You know what's wrong when someone who's a Jesus follower uses that word, I have to do it? Like, I have to serve in Bluff Junior, and I have to serve in Bluff Kids, and I have to do the hosting, and I have to do this or that. You know what happens when someone is in that mindset? They're not worshiping from a place of gratitude. They're not serving from a place of gratitude for what Jesus has done for them. They're self-centered in that moment where they want something given to them. A person in that mindset will not go the extra mile. They will not show the gospel and the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. But let me tell you who the true heroes are. The people who say, man, I get to do this. Right now, we've got amazing workers, and I know some of them are here this week as well, because it's your off week, who are serving back there with the mindset of, man, I get to do this. I get to share the love that Jesus has shown me. And we have people in this church body who go out and various different roles in this community and go into that mindset with, man, I get to do this. I get to look like Jesus in this space. I get to show his, man, those people are world changers. I would rather have 5 of them than 100 people who are like, man, I have to do this. Because the 5 will do more good in the world than all the ones who say, man, I have to do this. Because those 5, the ones who actually say, man, I get to do this, they recognize what Jesus has done for them. And they want to express that gratitude out for others. Let me tell you why this is so needed. For instance, those in Bluff Junior. You might look at them like, man, they're just watching kids. They're not. They see how they get to provide a service, and in one unique way, they are washing the feet of young families who feel comfortable enough to have a time with Jesus, to encounter him. That's something, when you go back there, pick up your kids, make sure you tell them thank you for that service. It's the same way with Bluff Kids. It's the same way with Relentless. It's the same way with the host team, right? When we look at this and say, man, I get to do this, that's when this worship actually means something. Because you can come in, you can have a great time. You can be like, God really spoke to me today. But faith that does not have a next step is pointless. A worship experience that doesn't have a next step, that doesn't do anything, man, that was pointless. We can't expect it to please God because he's watching us to see, okay, what are you going to do next? Who are you going to love next? Right? Because here's the summary of the entire point here. Right? Well, actually, I'm skipping ahead on something. Our charity is an expression of our gratitude. That's what James is getting at. But he also says one other thing that we oftentimes like to skip over. In fact, I almost skipped over by accident right here. In that verse, he talks about of if we want to live in a way that says, all hail the King, that actually pleases God. It first looks like our charity toward those who are in need of help around us. And there are plenty of people in need of help around us, even in this church. But it also involves our character. Listen to what James says in this full verse, and everything he says right here. In James 1:27, he says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. To keep oneself unstained from the world talks about moral integrity. It talks about if you are going to spend time with Jesus, the result should be that you look a little bit more like Jesus around you. That you come into relationships with the character that says, man, I spent time with him and he rubbed off on me, and now I'm able to love and look a little bit more like him, right? Because we can go and do all sorts of service, but then if we're turned around and we're mean and cruel to each other, our service meant nothing. But our charity must be matched with our character. This is what it looks like to please God in our worship. This is what worship that actually means something does. James understood this, that if people do not see a change in us from our worship, they will never see the value of our worship. That should scare us. Because if there are people in your life who look at worship and say, man, I don't see any value or any good that comes out of it, then you should ask yourself, man, am I representing Jesus well? Can they see in me that I want to do good for the sake of Jesus and be good? That I want to look like him? I want to be gentle and kind and caring like he was to me? Do I want to have a heart to help those who might be hurting around me? Do I have the willingness to love my fellow Jesus followers, the people in my church, when I see that they're in need? Or am I all right with being the one who's always served? And am I all right with treating people however I want to be treated, or however I think they should be treated? True worship changes us so that we might be forces of change for Jesus. True worship changes us so that we might be forces of change for Jesus. That's what this is all about, right? Jesus has made it possible for us to have a relationship with him, to have a relationship with our God and Creator. That should change who we are. But that change has a purpose. So that when you go tomorrow to wherever you are, you might be a force of change there. Some of you are going to school, either as a teacher, or as a student. Man, what an opportunity to show that your worship today actually meant something when you're in that space tomorrow, when you're talking to other classmates and other students, when you're showing each other love. That's when this matters. Otherwise, what are we here for? Man, Jesus has given us so much opportunities. So maybe for some of you, you're like, man, I need to actually step up because I recognize that there are people in my church family who maybe they have to be back there 2 or 3 times a week or 2 or 3 times a month because I'm not willing to step up and say, man, I want to be a part of whatever Jesus is doing. So maybe for some of you, you need to step up and help us here in this body. Or maybe for some of us, what we really need to do is show the love of Jesus in this community. Here's an easy way to do it. It's going to look like washing feet. It is not something that people are going to applaud you for. It is not something that people are going to give you a medal for or celebrate you for, but it is something that looks like Jesus. We have an opportunity for it this Friday. You see, we do this thing called getting trashy in our church. What that is on home games for the football team, when the final whistle blows, everyone you know flees. They're trying to get to their car. They're going to wait in the parking lot for 30 minutes and fight with everybody to get out. But us, we see an opportunity in that because the stands are going to be filthy. And so what we do on home games is an opportunity to just show the love of Jesus to the custodial staff. Without that help, we'll be there probably until dawn, cleaning that up when there's just 1 or 2 of them. But you can take, with a team of others, 15 minutes, clean the whole place. Get in your car. Get home at the exact same time you would have if you had just sat in your car the entire time. But you get to go home knowing, man, I brought a smile to Jesus' face because there was someone in need, and I stepped up to show the love of Jesus in there. And if you're interested in that, we've got sign-ups on that. Here's our leader, Chad Venable. He's our trash captain, our trashy captain, all right? Yeah. If you're interested in that, go and talk to him. Hey, there's like 4 or 5 home games this year. There's not a whole lot. But if you're going to be at the game, let me tell you, I'm not one of those who judges people, but if I go to the game and I catch eyes with you and then the final whistle blows and then you leave to go in the parking lot, I'm sorry, I'm going to be judging a little bit, right? Because I'm like, man, you missed an opportunity. You sit in your car for 30 minutes in the parking lot and think about what you're missing out on, right? 6 or 7 home games. There we go with playoffs. I forgot about that. We're going to win, right? So here's these amazing opportunities. It's not glamorous. It looks like getting on your knees and washing the feet of dirty fishermen. No one's going to applaud you except for the people in this body who know that you are looking like Jesus in that moment, who know you are taking your worship of Jesus outside of a Sunday morning hour, that it has an impact upon Monday morning and Tuesday morning for your life. That's where you're going to find the celebration is in this body. People who are going to look at you with pride and say, man, you look like Jesus. And that's worth it. Won't you pray with me? Jesus, thank you so much for this journey that you've taken us on of worship. It's challenging. The easy thing is just to come in, sing a few songs, and think that was it and walk out. But this journey has shown us that, man, how we treat others before we come in here, that has a real impact upon our time together. You've shown us that when we are actually together, that should be something that's important to us, that it should be something sacred because we recognize that you have made us into something sacred now and that you've made us dispensers of your grace and mercy. And so we should use that when we're with other people. And now you show us, man, if we're going to truly live a life that says all hail the King, then this time right here, man, that only has meaning come tomorrow morning. And so, Father, I pray for those in this body that we might walk out of here with a heart that says, man, I want to live a life that says all hail the King. I want to live a truly authentic life with Jesus, and I know that's going to involve me having an open eye to those who might be hurting or those who need my help. Maybe there's a coworker this week who's going to have an opportunity for me to step up and help them, to go the extra mile for them. And they might not show appreciation for that, but I know you're going to be pleased by it. May we have those moments this week, Jesus. Those moments where we know we pleased you because we were willing to be there for someone else, willing to serve, willing to love, willing to be kind and caring. So, Father, I pray that that might be the testimony of our church, that we are not about Sunday morning, that we are about Monday morning, that Sunday morning is about preparing us so that we might be Jesus followers when we walk out of here. Help us to be like that. It's in your name we pray. Amen.